Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am your host, as always, Jesse Collings. I am doing this show on my own today because we have a mailbag. My goal for these mailbag episodes, and I might have detailed this in my previous episode, but my goal has kind of been to do one each quarter. So I have like a fall mailbag, a winter mailbag, a spring mailbag, and a summer mailbag. I think that's a good pattern. So do four a year essentially. I think the last one I did was in November, so now's the perfect time to do it. Now that we're into March. Don't want it to grow too tired of a gimmick because part it's kind of lazy. But I love answering questions. I'm always really impressed by the quality of the questions I get, and this quarter's edition is no exception. So let's just get started. My first question, this came from Twitter. Chris Bork on Twitter. He says, what do you think is the threshold for WWE to see a decline in consumer metrics, like was the case until recent years? Triple H's booking seems low effort and scandals are rocking the company, but there is no drop in viewers and attendance. Yeah, I mean, this is definitely something that I think we've been speculated on for a long time, was ever since the first Vince scandal hit, and the first Wall Street Journal article came out, and Vince appeared on that SmackDown episode promoting himself, almost like, oh, how is he going to react to these allegations? WWE has been like way up in attendance since then. Um, Television ratings have reflected that, and when the second angle hit, or not the second angle, but the second, Wall Street Journal kind of story hit, and Vince was forced to resign, that just led to more interest. And I think there was a lot of interest in Paul Levesque and kind of what the creative product was going to be under him. And really, WWE has been riding that boom period for since then, and it has not slowed down. It has even gained momentum. So, what are we witnessing there, and kind of what could possibly happen to kind of knock them off from that kind of streak? And that's kind of what Chris is asking here. I think for starters, like scandals, it, those are not, we have enough evidence to say like those aren't really going to impact WWE's business metrics. If anything, they've helped. I don't think that like anything that's come out so far really has been able to make an impact on WWE in a negative way in terms of fans losing interest and not watching and not going to live shows. I think that was really apparent at the Royal Rumble this year, which is like just 2 days before the Royal Rumble. Um, this story came out, the law of the Wall Street Journal and the lawsuit, and people had read, a lot of people had read all the lawsuit um by Janelle Grant towards WWE and Vince McMahon, and Vince stepped down, and there was all of that. But when the Royal Rumble came around, people all tuned in to watch the Rumble. I know many, many people who I would consider casual fans. They were excited to watch the Rumble and talk about the Rumble and things like that. So that kind of told me is like, okay, the regular fan does not really care about these scandals and the whole Vince thing, and the grossness of it and the culpability of a lot of the people that are still in the company, even though Vince is gone. That's not really going to impact business metrics. We just haven't seen any evidence to suggest that. And that's kind of true if you look at like scandals in other sports over the last like 10 or 15 years. There really haven't been a lot of, for all the controversies that might have taken place in certain sports, there really hasn't been a decline in popularity you could point to. I know like people will go back and point at like the 1994 baseball strike and say, well, it took baseball several years to kind of recover from that scandal, which wasn't really a scandal. It was baseball stopped happening for 6 months or whatever. Um, they didn't have a World Series that year, but like you look at some of the NFL scandals, whether it's concussions or players getting arrested or Aaron Hernandez murdering people or like whatever scandal you want to pick, like that hasn't really impacted the NFL at all. I can't really think of any other like scandals in salaciousness that have happened in major sports that have really impacted their overall popularity in the last 10 or 15 years. Certainly things like in UFC, Doesn't matter how many scandals, controversial comments, fighters getting in trouble, fighters getting arrested, people failing drug tests, whatever happens there, still there's no real decline in UFC metrics as well. So I don't think scandal in general is just going to hurt the company. What I'll say is, and I think there are some other questions in this mailbag that kind of touch on this as well, but in terms of like Triple H's booking, I think there are elements of it. I agree that they're low effort. Um, and there hasn't been what I would call like a lot of positive progression since he's took over. It's a lot of really long running storylines. It's a lot of people who have been champion for a really long time. Not a lot happens week to week. You would think that would burn out the audience, and people would stop tuning out. But there have been elements that I think have been positive to kind of keep that momentum going. I think something like the LA Knight getting over organically with the audience and WWE giving him a sincere push. They gave him a main event match for the world title against Roman Reigns on the last Saudi Arabia show. And even though LA Knight didn't win the title, and even though LA Knight has kind of been phased down since then, the idea is they still delivered something that fans wanted. And I think the fans that are into WWE now and are into Paul Levesque as Booker, they would have not felt the same way if Vince McMahon was still in charge because they would assume that Vince would have buried LA Knight, that he would have made him a joke, that he would have never taken him seriously, would have never given him a sincere push, no matter how much the fans rallied behind him. And the fact that Paul Levesque did do that for LA Knight, I think keeps that optimism going. So that's why we're a few years into Paul Levesque taking over from Vince McMahon and Vince McMahon really being hands off in the company for the last, I don't know, 6 to 8 months. That has really, I think, kept that momentum going. So it's not just that transition period from last, I think it was last summer when the first Wall Street Journal story broke and Vince McMahon resigned. Um, we're still seeing that momentum be kept up, even though objectively I can look at it and say, there's a lot of boring stuff going on, and it's not for me. And why don't other fans see this? I do think that there has been enough progressive things happening with WWE's booking that I think has entertained a lot of these fans who maybe returned to the product when Paul Levesque first took over. And there's been some really fortuitous stuff that's happened for them. CM Punk fell right into their lap at the perfect time when I think their business was starting to stagnate a little bit. You can look at the business metrics and see the Raw and SmackDown ratings kind of plateauing, kind of starting to dip down. You could see live attendance slightly beginning to cool off. And then Punk came back into the company, and that was a huge business mover for the relatively brief period of time that he was, around before he got injured. But that really helped re-energize the product in a way. And then, of course, The Rock coming back and being on SmackDown and being engaged in this feud with Roman Reigns and Cody Rhodes, who are their two biggest stars in the company, and leading up to what feels like a really hot WrestleMania period. Like, I don't know how many TV tapings they've sold out in a row, but I think it's like six or something, like over 11,000 fans for Raw and SmackDown week after week after week. It's hugely impressive from a business perspective, and I think all of that has to be attributed to The Rock really coming in and the road to WrestleMania and really making this upcoming next month and into WrestleMania feel like a huge deal to WWE fans. And that was something you couldn't really predict. That's something that, The Rock wants to do this, and because he wants to do this, he is around on television, and he's around in the biggest angle the company has had in a very long time. So that stuff's like fortuitous, but it's helping keep this hot streak going. Now, after WrestleMania, when The Rock is presumably not around anymore, um, that will be kind of a bigger test for how hot this company really is. What is going to happen at WrestleMania to kind of carry the company creatively over the next few months? Is Cody Rhodes going to be the world champion? Is he going to be like a hot new champion? Or will Cody Rhodes, if he wins the title, will he have peaked at WrestleMania and he's not going to be feel like a hot new champion because the story was more about him chasing the title than it wasn't him getting the title? That remains to be seen. Um, so I'm really interested in knowing kind of where that creative goes. I kind of think I look at Paul Levesque's like booking ability, and I think that this guy's never going to make it. I think that he's just not, he doesn't appear to be a particularly creative person. You can look at what's happened since his booking has taken over. Yes, he's responded positively to things like LA Knight getting over, but there's not a lot of ideas being tossed around on these shows. It's a heel stable, whether that's the Bloodline or Judgment Day or Damage Control. They're kind of in control of a title or control of a situation, and then the baby faces team up and fight them, and they have this kind of endless series of tag team matches. And that seems to be like his one idea because it's on all of the WWE main roster programming. And you see, like, I don't know who their big young stars are going to be on the roster, especially you take The Rock away, you take CM Punk is still out, Roman's not around anymore. We'll see what happens with the Drew McIntyre contract situation. He does seem like someone who is really starting to reestablish himself as a real top entity in the company, and probably if he wrestles like Seth Rollins at um WrestleMania, which I believe is official now, he should win that title. But you look at like who's the young people in the roster, who is going to be around to be fresh and exciting after WrestleMania once kind of these bigger stars take a step back. And that's a real question I have. And it's hard to keep momentum going for years and years and years and years. You have to be a really creative booker, and I'm just not sure Paul Levesque is that. But that all remains to be seen. The next question I have is from Common Sense on Twitter. He says, what steps can other promotions take to level the perceptions that WWE has psychologically instilled in wrestling fandom? Some of the examples Common Sense gives here are like big guys draw, you need more vignettes to dumb it down for an audience, etc. So kind of like when you hear these arguments about what AEW needs to do to grow, and it's coming from people that always just kind of repeat basically Vince isms back. Like Vince loves big guys. He thinks they can draw. Vince dumbs down his product to reach an audience. So we've definitely heard all of those criticisms instilled towards AEW since the company was first started. In Common Sense, I asked what steps can other promotions take to kind of remove those perceptions. And there's another question like this in this mailbag. And I just think the most obvious answer is just AEW needs to be around for longer, and AEW needs to remain relevant to people for decades, just like WWE has. The reason that people have those perceptions is because WWE has been the undisputed number one leader in the industry for decades, and there really hasn't been anyone close to a challenger. I don't expect AEW to overcome WWE and become the new number one in the industry, but AEW has been around for a number of years. They have very strong television reach. They have major pay-per-view events. They have run successful stadium shows. Um, they are they just need to continue to do that for generations of fans, and AEW needs to not fall into those traps, not run their company under the guise of like what Vince McMahon would do. Um, not be concerned about big guys drawing, not be concerned about vignettes dumbing down the audience. Those criticisms are always going to be there from people that don't know any better. But I think the only way to really uh regain some of what has been lost during WWE's monopolistic years over the company is for another company to be around and be relevant and be popular and to do things differently. I think, a lot of the tropes that people say that AEW needs to do, that really just comes from people not knowing any better. That's really only comes from people being familiar with only one type of product, and that's the WWE product, and just kind of assuming that that's the ideal way to do things, and that's the only way to do things, which I think most listeners to my show will know and believe that that is not true. There are many different ways to do things, and that AEW should probably be pursuing those instead of WWE, but it's going to be have to be it's going to take a lot of time. It's not something that's going to be solved overnight. As we're seeing, AEW's been around since 2019. We're now in 2024. We're definitely still seeing those perceptions, but we might be seeing them a little less. I definitely think that I don't hear that like it's kind of funny and to WWE's credit, WWE doesn't really operate like this anymore, or certainly not nearly to the degree that they used to. But you don't really hear that big guy. You need a big guy to draw. You don't hear the term like vanilla midget anymore as much, as much. You don't hear the idea that like no one wants to watch these cruiserweights or no one wants to watch guys do flippity doos. You'll hear that from some people. You'll always hear it from some people, but that definitely seems like something that's kind of gone away um over the last 5 years since AEW started. Um so I do think some of these perceptions are going to die eventually. Um but it's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take AEW remaining relevant as a wrestling entity to the mainstream wrestling audience to kind of solve that. Diego Garcia has two questions here. I will start with one, and his first question is, do you think playing a dumb and evil caricature character on TV permeates the collective view the world has on Vince when the allegations started, which is treating him like a father figure who should be defended? I think there are two kind of separate things going on here. I definitely think the idea that Vince being like playing the evil Mr. McMahon character definitely to the mainstream media led to a lot of unserious coverage of it. I talked about this at the time, but when the first Wall Street Journal article broke about all these NDAs and these sexual harassment incidents, like I was watching like CNN, and CNN was showing B-roll footage while they're talking about these allegations, and it's footage of not Vince McMahon, but the Mr. McMahon character. They showed him, you know, strutting down to the ring. They showed him, getting his head shaved by Donald Trump at WrestleMania 23. They showed these really obnoxious, over the top, evil Mr. McMahon moments in character, which led to like unserious coverage of the situation, and it made the allegations seem like fake or predictable because they were showing this in character person. It would be like if um there were allegations out there against Ralph Fiennes, the actor. And it's when they were showing B-roll of like, oh, new allegations against Ralph Fiennes, and they showed, like video of him as Voldemort or a video of him in Schindler's List, like playing a bad evil person in a movie. I don't think they would ever do that because it'd be ridiculous to talk about allegations towards Ralph Fiennes and they show him like fighting Harry Potter as Voldemort. And that's kind of the equivalent of showing like very real allegations, they had very real allegations against Vince McMahon, and they were showing him in character playing this evil, business tycoon. And I definitely think helped like WWE skate, and Vince originally didn't get as much heat as he probably should have for those allegations because I think the mainstream media didn't take them seriously enough because they just viewed it as carny wrestling. And oh, of course, Vince McMahon, that crazy, wrestling promoter, of course he did some, you know, reprehensible stuff. He's Vince McMahon. He's an evil guy. Here, look at him. Look at him as this character strutting to the ring. It's that was really disappointing to me. Now, I think like treating him like a father figure who should be defended, like I think that just comes from people um really being feeling like WWE is their childhood and that they love WWE and by extension love Vince McMahon, and that they have this deep emotional tie to Vince McMahon because they associate him with this thing that they love, which when you have something that you love, you often view that as an extension of yourself. So if people are saying really mean things, about saying like really mean things about Vince McMahon, then that means they're saying really mean things about WWE, which is this thing people love, which people view as an extension of themselves, and they take that stuff kind of personally. And so that's why you see, I think, a lot of like the really crazy, unhinged, like you can't, he wasn't all good, but he did make our, he was the man behind our or this thing we love. So we have to give him credit. When you see stuff like that, I think that's just people being insecure about being able to separate this thing that they like from themselves. And they view kind of the Vince McMahon allegations as almost a personal attack on themselves, which is ridiculous, but I think that's what you're seeing. I don't think it necessarily has to do with like him playing a character on TV as much as the knowledge of how instrumental he was in WWE and presenting this product that people really liked and feel a really heavy, nostalgic, emotional attraction to. Diego's second question is, you would keep the belt on Samoa Joe so Okada beats him, or would you put the belt on Swerve, or would you set up Swerve to chase Hangman? This is a fantasy booking question, and most people are going to be listening to this after. I'm recording this on Saturday, but I imagine most people are going to be listening to this after AEW Revolution during the week. So, this is kind of old. This is going to be old for pretty much everyone listening. What I would do, I mean, honestly, I think all of these options work. I think you could keep the title on Samoa Joe. I think you could have Swerve win the title, and I think you could have Hangman win the title and kind of make it so Swerve is chasing after Hangman. I think all of those would work. Um, it's just a matter of how they're executed and kind of how the characters are presented. I do like the idea of Hangman winning the title and then Swerve kind of as the babyface now chasing this unhinged Hangman who's kind of been driven over the edge by Swerve's actions. And I think that would be a really effective double turn and add a lot of juice to this company where we haven't seen Hangman as a heel before. Swerve has kind of been trending babyface for a while. I think that would add a lot to the company. You don't necessarily need the title to do that, but I do think having this really strong angle being centered around your world title is a good thing. So I think that's something that would be worth pursuing. Maybe they have would have already done that when people are listening to this. So let's hope, right? Avengers 23 asks, what makes a Shades of Grey character work in 2024? What was the last successful Shades of Grey character who was the main focus of a major wrestling company? I mean, I would say that we have seen plenty of Shades of Grey characters be pushed into prominent spots um, in wrestling. I think that Roman Reigns is a Shades of Grey character for starters. I think that, like, on paper, he is a pretty obvious bully heel who cheats in his matches, but for a lot of fans, he comes across as like the coolest guy in the company. And so he's got a lot of fan support and he's got a lot of people, sticking their number one finger in the air when he comes out or when the Usos come out. And so he's not like a traditional heel where he comes out and he gets like this mega heat and people just really want to see him get beat. That's part of his character, but he's also in a lot of ways the biggest babyface character in the company, and certainly was up until like Cody's arrival or maybe Sami Zayn's turn on him. So I would say he's a Shades of Grey character, but maybe in a more traditional sense, I think like John Moxley's character or Bryan Danielson's character or the entire BCC have been Shades of Grey. I think that they have been heels, they have been baby faces. Right now, they're feuding with FTR. It seems kind of like a babyface versus babyface feud, but um, not kind of, but not really. Like Bryan Danielson, he's basically working as a heel. Certainly in the Eddie Kingston feud, he's a heel, but we've also seen him work babyface in some matches this year. So I would say that those are shades of great characters. I think that that's kind of maybe Avengers 23. You're thinking like you're thinking this a much more like uh literal than maybe I would interpret it. Like to me, I think like the future of wrestling is these shades of gray characters. I think there are very few wrestlers who are going to be successful in a major role being pigeonholed as the obvious heel and the obvious babyface. I don't think the wrestling fandom works like that anymore, and frankly, it hasn't worked like that in a long time. You can go back to like the NWO and Steve Austin, where morally these people were probably heels, but they were also baby faces. Steve Austin was definitely presented as a babyface. Um, and so I just think that's the way characters go. I think sometimes when you focus too much on who's going to be the heel and who's going to be the babyface and who's the crowd going to cheer for, like those are nice philosophical fundamentals to book around, but it's also not realistic to how fans view wrestling today. Fans are going to respect heels who are good at their job, even if they are um, morally in the wrong, and vice versa. Fans are gonna maybe not like baby faces if they don't not doing a good job, even if they're morally in the right. We see that on pretty much every wrestling show. So I think that's I think that's just kind of the future of wrestling. I know Cody's talked about this a lot, and it's kind of funny because Cody's been like a super white meat baby face since he came back to WWE. But I think the idea of like pure babyface and pure heel, there's not a lot of wrestlers that are going to be in that role. I think like right now, I would say like Christian Cage is like an obvious pure heel character. Um, there's really nothing likable about him. He does get a lot of heat. People want to see him lose. Um, so I'd say like he's one of the few guys I think is really making it work in that role. Um, but it's just there's not a lot of people that are going to thrive, I think, in 2024 without at least having a little elements of shades of gray. Haida Owin or Haida Zero Win, not sure how he pronounces that name, but they ask, TKO are going to have a focus on delivering profits, and one of the best ways to do that is to slash costs like payroll, where they already pay a much smaller percentage of revenue than many other sports leagues. A number of name wrestlers are approaching the end of their contracts with WWE. Do you think WWE will spend or look to shed some payroll, figuring they can replace the likes of Seth or Becky with washed MMA fighters or NIL athletes fresh from the Performance Center? Um, I would say that WWE is not interested, under TKO. WWE has not really seemed to be that interested in bidding wars for talent. We have seen if someone is available and Tony Khan wants them, Tony Khan is willing to offer them a deal that WWE has not been able to match. Um, Now, part of that might also be additional perks that come with working in AEW, maybe a lighter schedule, maybe you don't have to live in a certain place, like Kazuchika Okada, maybe not having to live in the United States if he works for AEW, but having to do so if he's in WWE. But I agree in the general sense that it doesn't seem like TKO is interested in spending a lot of money. They're looking on how quick they can increase profits, and a huge reason the way to increase profits is to shed some salary. And if you view most of your talent as replaceable, then it becomes pretty obvious what to do. I don't really know, with Levesque, with Vince gone, with Vince really, seemingly no longer having any power in WWE, it's kind of hard to figure out who is really going to be controlling the purse strings in that company, who is going to be making financial decisions with personnel. Is it going to be Paul Levesque? Is it going to be Nick Khan? Is it going to be Mark Shapiro? Like, who are those people who's going to be the ultimate decision maker? Because when it was Vince, it was kind of easy because Vince was a wrestling guy and he liked certain talent and he was going to be able to match, salaries and want to keep talents because of who he is and kind of his view of them. I think like Charlotte signed a contract extension, and I think she signed that when Vince was still in power, and that seems to me like a Vince play. Like Vince obviously really liked Charlotte Flair, and so he gave her a big contract extension. But with Vince gone, I don't know if Paul Levesque has that same kind of authority to kind of if they have a salary structure to blow up that salary structure if those wrestlers get a better offer. Um, I definitely think WWE views most of the people on their roster as replaceable. Um, would Seth Rollins or Becky Lynch count as replaceable? I'm not 100% sure. I don't know just exactly how they view those talents. I don't think that they're going to cut Roman Reigns. I don't think that they would be looking to shed payroll for Cody. Um, but kind of everyone else beneath that, I think it's up in the air, and it also depends on how interested Tony is in them. Because if Tony isn't interested in a wrestler coming from WWE, and he's not interested enough to make them a really competitive offer, then those wrestlers don't have a lot of leverage. If Tony doesn't like you, or Tony doesn't feel like you're worth a sizable investment, your lever as a wrestler, your leverage negotiating with WWE is greatly diminished because you're not going to be able to get a ton of money from New Japan. You're not going to be able to get a ton of money from Impact. You're not going to be able to make a ton of money on the indies. You're really counting on Tony having an interest in you and Tony wanting you and Tony offering you a big deal. Um, that's not that hasn't if that's not the case, and I don't know if Tony likes Seth, I don't know if Tony likes Becky, I don't know who Tony likes and does not like that's on WWE's roster right now. But if Tony's not really interested in making that kind of a competitive bid, then I think you're if you're a wrestler in WWE, you are in danger of getting a pay cut if they don't think you're worth X amount of dollars, and they're looking to shed payroll. Um, I definitely think that I don't know about the washed MMA fighters bit. I think like we've seen TKO doesn't like to pay MMA fighters. They don't think they can draw with them. And they do view all but a very small handful of MMA fighters as replaceable. I think they think Connor is a big draw. They think John Jones is a big draw. But it seems like anyone underneath that they can pound sand. Like that's basically what they told Francis Ngannou, and he was arguably their most exciting fighter. That was probably should be one of the biggest faces in MMA. And I think he was their world heavyweight champion. And he wanted X amount of dollars, and they didn't feel like he was worth it. And he went off to become a boxer in Saudi Arabia instead. So I definitely think that talent is at risk here for um getting hit with a pay cut or not having that leverage. It all depends on what Tony really wants to do. Tony holds the power here for all of these talents. Um, and I know there are wrestlers that you would think that Tony would like, and he doesn't like. Johnny Gargano is a perfect example. If Tony wanted Johnny Gargano, Johnny Gargano would be in AEW because Johnny Gargano was a free agent for a long time. He did eventually go back to WWE, but there was a window there for Tony to sign Johnny Gargano. You would think that Tony would like Johnny Gargano and want to make an offer for him because of his wrestling style, and obviously Gargano has a really long relationship with people like the Best Friends and um, a ton of members of AEW's roster. I'm sure Tony's very familiar with his work, but for whatever reason, Tony doesn't seem to really like Johnny Gargano, and so he never got an offer to go there. So he kind of bided his time and was able to get back into WWE, but Tony didn't like him, so he had to go back so he went back to WWE. And I don't know if he took a pay cut or not when he went back to WWE. Um, Other guys like Braun Strowman, same thing, right? Was released. Tony probably didn't really like him that much. Went back to WWE. Bray Wyatt, another one, right? Released tons of rumors about maybe him coming to AEW. Whatever reason, Tony didn't want to sign him. Went back to WWE. So it really comes down to what Tony wants to do. And if Tony's not interested in these guys or women, they're gonna end back up at WWE, maybe at significantly less contracts. But again, a lot of that depends on who is really ultimately controlling the budget, who is ultimately making the decision in regards to spending on personnel, how much of an influence does Paul Levesque have in on that, how much of that is being handled by like non-wrestling people, and kind of what is that relationship like. We don't really know anything like that. We can only maybe learn some of that as time goes on and more of these wrestlers become available via free agency. Tail Avery says, who are your top 5 all-time New England wrestlers? And so I guess I'm interpreting this as like who are my favorite wrestlers that are from New England. And I don't know if I could rank them like in order. There aren't, I'll be honest, there are not a ton of wrestlers from New England that jump out to me as being like among my favorite wrestlers. Like John Cena is probably the biggest star from New England, but I wouldn't say like John Cena is one of my favorite wrestlers ever. Um, Triple H is from New England. I will say this, Triple H is from Nashua, New Hampshire, which is about 35 minutes north of where I live. It's pretty close to Boston. But because his entire career in WWE has been billed as being from Connecticut, and he's associated with WWE's office and the McMahons in Stamford, Connecticut, and West Greenwich, Connecticut, like which are like essentially suburbs of New York City. Like people don't, I don't think people really think of Triple H as a New England wrestler or a guy from New England because he's from like the New York part of Connecticut, which, as many people know, I don't believe that Connecticut is really part of New England. Certainly not the Stamford West Greenwich part is that's like a suburb of New York. It doesn't have the New England culture that the rest of New England has. So I am a firm believer that Connecticut is not part of New England. But Levesque is from Nashua, New Hampshire, which is very much part of New England. But he doesn't really come across as a New England guy. He's also not one of my five favorite wrestlers ever, so or would be even close to that discussion. So I probably wouldn't say him either. I'm not like the biggest Monet fan, so I wouldn't say she's in my top five either. But I've got to put some people in it. I would say people that I've really liked that are from New England, I would definitely say Eddie Edwards. Um, who's from, I believe he's from Boston. I'm not 100% sure on that, but he's definitely someone whose work I've enjoyed for pretty much his entire career. It's kind of a little sad that, he's kind of became like this garbage wrestler in Impact. But I really loved his work in Noah when he was a GHC champion. I thought that was like a really underrated run. I know a ton of people weren't watching it, but I thought he had some really excellent matches and was a very good champion. And that was kind of the last I really paid attention to him. But obviously going back to his Ring of Honor days and things like that, he's definitely in the conversation. Um, Kofi is probably in the conversation. I would probably say him. Kofi is from Winchester, Massachusetts. Um, I think he was originally born in Ghana, but he grew up in Winchester, Mass, which is from where I live now, just a stone's throw away. Um, so I would put him, and he came up through the New England indie scene before getting signed by WWE. So I'd say Kofi's in the mix. Um, Matt Taven, who's from Derry, New Hampshire. I've been an unabashed Taven fan for a long time. I think he's gotten a really unnecessary amount of criticism. Uh, I've loved his work in Ring of Honor. I thought he was a really good Ring of Honor world champion, even though everyone made fun of him. I thought he's a guy that I've seen work really hard and get over pretty much everywhere he's gone, whether that was in New Japan, whether that was in CMLL, and whether that was in Ring of Honor. And I think, his work in AEW, I mean, obviously a lot of people have a lot of criticisms for kind of how he's been presented and the way, he's been involved with Roderick Strong and Adam Cole, but he had that match with Orange Cassidy a couple weeks ago, which I thought was really, really good. And it was mainly really, really good because Matt Taven put in a hell of an effort. So I'm a big Taven fan. Um, Biff Busick, whose career's just never quite gone the way that I wanted it to. Um, Kind of been in and out of WWE. I think he might be in WWE right now as a trainer. Uh, I don't think he's really wrestling anymore. But his last few years in the Indies, I thought he was a really, really excellent, complete wrestler. Did do some pretty good work at NXT as Oney Lorcan. He's not that old. I'd love to see him kind of back as a fixture, whether that's on the Indies more often or even if it was just wrestling in NXT, just a chance to see him because I think he is really, really good. And has never really been able to get a fair chance. Um, so one more spot. I mean, there's a bunch of guys. There's like guys like Perry Saturn, who I never really liked. He's from Boston. Um, Kevin Sullivan, of course, is from Boston. Um, China is from New Hampshire. Scotty Tuhati is from Maine. Um, trying to think. Hmm. So Kofi, Eddie Edwards, um, Biff Busick, Matt Taven. Quincy Bennett is there in the mix. I do like Vincent. Vincent's from Rhode Island. Um, so maybe I don't know Vince all time though. I don't know if Vincent would be in my all time top five. Um, Carmelo Hayes is from Framingham, Mass. I don't know if he would be my top five either, although I do like Carmelo. Um, hmm, this is a tough one because I can get to that four pretty quickly. But that fifth one, there might be someone really obvious that I'm forgetting, but I might have to get back to you on this tale. Because I'm not sure who I would pick for that fifth slot. Um, might take a little bit more thought. Uh, moving on to a topic probably more people care about. SD Jones asks, is this the most stacked roster in WWE history? Now I know you're joking, SD Jones, because this is a parody of one of the questions that Paul Levesque was asked during the Royal Rumble press conference, instead of being asked more questions about Vince. Um, but I do want to make a point that when that question was asked, like after that Royal Rumble, especially the men's Rumble, like that Royal Rumble sucked. And the reason that Royal Rumble sucked was because there was very few interesting people in the match, which would tell you where this roster really is. I do think that they're in a good spot in terms of absolute top star power right now. You have The Rock, you have Roman Reigns, you have Cody Rhodes, you have Drew McIntyre starting to take off. You still got Seth Rollins around. You got Punk on the mend. Like you do have talent at the very, very top, but as I mentioned earlier, just where is that next wave of young talent coming from? I don't see anyone in NXT that would be inspiring that kind of confidence, especially on the men's side. Um, I don't really see like a lot of the roster is old. A lot of the roster is, you know, 35, 40 and older. You look at who you have, Sami Zayn, Kevin Owens, those guys have been around for a while. They're old. New Day, those guys have been around forever. They're old. I think Drew is like 35, 36. Randy Orton, obviously, he's Randy Orton, but he's in his 40s. Uh, you don't have a lot of talent that feels like they're really in their primes or new and exciting talents. Even a guy like LA Knight, he's in his 40s. And it just you look at this, I don't think anyone cares about the mid card, really, outside of a Falter, um, who I feel like they have at a certain ceiling, and that ceiling is not in the main event role. Um, you look at these guys like Dominic, who's a waste. Austin Theory, he's no good. We've seen that with him. Grayson Waller, he's not a main event guy. Um, there's just not a lot like you got guys like Montez Ford who been talked about. Oh, Montez Ford, breakout star. Hasn't he been around for like 10 years now? Like when did that group debut in NXT? The Street Profits. Like that's got to be like what 2017 or so. That was 7 years ago. So, like, is he ever gonna get a real significant push? It doesn't seem like it. So just like I don't really see like I look at this WWE roster and I just don't see where that like next generation talent is coming from. And I'll be honest, like I've said this before, like I've never felt further away from the mindset of the average WWE fan. So maybe they view some of these talents differently than I do. And I'm not 100% sure who is going to get over. I just don't know what that fan base really wants specifically anymore. So I might be off base in this, but I'm really skeptical of kind of, especially when we get past the WrestleMania season and The Rock goes away and the Roman Reigns isn't around and CM Punk is still hasn't been back yet. Like, where is that top talent going to be coming from? And we saw this kind of towards last year when you had things like Shinsuke Nakamura wrestling, Seth Rollins in the main event of back-to-back pay-per-views. Um, which is just like that's something that like the Nakamura who's been watched for years, um, that's not like a great sign for the overall depth of the roster. It's more of just like kind of oh, we need somebody to challenge for Seth and we have no one really ready. Let's just throw Nakamura out there. And you have these two really forgettable matches that I don't think drew particularly well. And I don't know where that's coming from. Um, I don't know where that next wave of interesting guys is coming from. And I don't like if it's not going to come from NXT and they're really struggling to sign people the contracts and they're going to let other people go like we were discussing earlier, like if some people are going to see their contracts expire and they're going to whether jump to AEW or whatever, that's going to thin the field out even more. I mean, we don't know what's happening with Drew's contract. It would seem like he's probably signed an extension based on how he's being pushed, but if he hasn't and he leaves, that's another huge blow because at least he's someone that hasn't been super overexposed over the last, 10 years and someone who's capable of doing great work and is someone who I think the fans are by as a main event talent. Um, and if he leaves, it's really getting thin. Um, so yeah, I think this the roster should probably be scrutinized more than it is, just in terms of like where's the exciting under 35 talent on the roster and where would those people be coming from? Because I don't really feel like they're in NXT either. Um, Next question is Prince. He asks, regarding wrestling production, do you think the WWE way of producing American TV wrestling is too entrenched in the eyes and minds of the fans and TV people? That alternative production setups are too difficult or impossible to introduce to the wider audience? Do you see, as an example, the current AEW setup that went in a more WWE direction with the LED boards and ringside commentary tables? So this is kind of similar to question earlier that Common Sense asked, which was Common Sense was more focused on like kind of the WWE tropes. Prince is asking kind of very specifically the production, but the idea is the same that WWE has been around for so long that their way has been kind of entrenched in this is the only way to do things. This is the only way to produce a wrestling show. It's the only way the show can look. Um, I personally don't think that AEW has too many like WWE similarities in terms of production. Um, in the stuff that they do copy, I don't think is particularly bad. I don't really care that the commentary table is at ringside. And they have like when I notice it's not just the ringside commentary table, but it's like the commentary table is the same make of like the WWE commentary table, right? It's not like a normal table. It's like this collapsible structure that can be kind of collapse at any time when someone gets put through it. But I think that's like a good gimmick that WWE has, and I don't mind that AEW has copied having the ringside table there for people to like, springboard off the ring and crash through towards. I think that's fine. LED boards, I wouldn't even notice that, if I'm being honest. Every major sports um league, if you watch on television, has LED boards. I guess WWE does that as well, but I don't really see that as a WWE like trope. Um, but like can't like I'd be worried about the camera cuts. I'd be worried about the verbiage. Those would be like the two production things that I WWE has that I wouldn't want to see in AEW. Um, And I don't get that sense that AEW is headed down that route. I don't find that there are excessive camera cuts, and I don't find their verbiage obnoxious. So it doesn't really bother me at all. And and to be fair, I don't really see a lot of criticism about AEW's production from like a oh, they need to be more like WWE sense, the way you do for like their wrestling product. Like you definitely see people say they need more vignettes, they need to explain things, they need to tell stories. Definitely hear a lot of that. Um, but I don't really hear a lot of like they need to have more camera cuts or they need to shoot wrestling like this. I don't hear that a lot from people, even the bad faith actors. So I don't really see that. yes, there are different ways to do things, and maybe are you hesitating to do certain production things because they've never been done before? And the reason they've never been done before is because WWE has had a monopoly over wrestling television for the last 20 years, and they've never experimented like that. Um, then yes, but I don't see that as a real major problem. But some people might disagree. Some people might be really bothered by some of the more minor stuff that I'm overlooking. So I think it's really in the eye of the beholder. Um, Refused Party Program asks, do you believe that this year, 2024, is as low as wrestling discourse gets on the whole, or are we yet to bottom out? That's a good question. I think a lot of it would depend on one's social media usage. Like, I'm on Twitter less than I have been in previous years. So to me, I don't think the discourse is worse than it was a few years ago, but that's probably because I'm not consuming it nearly as much. If you're on Twitter, you're on Reddit, or you're on the board, or you're in Discord channels, or it really depends on one's experience in terms of how low stuff is getting. I definitely think like since AEW was founded, we've reached, a new low in terms of just how much time we spend talking about stupid people who don't understand AEW's product, don't want to understand AEW's product, want to make bad suggestions that are related to only knowing WWE's product. Uh, so I definitely think that's pretty low. And again, that will improve the longer AEW is around. And a lot of it will be like once, obviously, you're always going to get the absolute worst faith actors that are never going to give an inch on this kind of stuff. But when AEW signs a new TV deal, and it hasn't been signed yet, it's important to know it has not been signed yet. But if or when AEW signs a new strong TV deal, whether that's with Time Warner or someone else, or TNT or someone else, uh, I think that you'll see a lot of like the anxiety about AEW's existence die down a little bit. Some of it will always still be there, but I think a lot of like the bad discourse comes from people's fear of AEW going away. And if AEW has, a lot more security and a bright future, I think you'll see um some of that dial down, and we'll see less of the sky is falling doom kind of discourse that we get sometimes when some negative AEW news hits or a rating is too low or something like that. Um, and like I've said in some of my other responses, the longer AEW is around and established, you'll get the less power some of those dumb WWE criticisms will have with the average person, because if AEW can prove that other ways of doing things works, then you'll see um a change in kind of um how we talk about those things. So I think in a way, yeah, this is probably as low as it's gonna get, but obviously things can get worse. But a lot of it depends on like one social media use and kind of how in the next 10 or 15 years, how are we going to communicate with one another, and how are we going to kind of witness other conversations? Are we going to become more and more entrenched in social media, and are we going to be in this bigger and bigger pool? Um, Or are we going to, as we're seeing kind of people get up, more people get off of Twitter for various reasons, are we going to see kind of less of this? Are we going to see more of like this, going back into, I know Joe talks about this a lot, like going back into our echo chambers, going back into our separate kind of worlds, like going into closed Discord servers where kind of everyone is relatively on the same page and kind of what they view. And you're not having these conversations where like I am talking to someone with a Roman Reigns avatar on Twitter, or seeing what WWE Gareth or whoever, pick your favorite troll, is saying on Twitter if I'm not on there. Uh, but I don't know kind of what the general direction society is going to head in terms of social media interaction. But it seems like the more we get, the more we become entrenched in social media, and the more we become more open to other people from around the world seeing what we post, like you would on Twitter. Um, the worse the discourse is going to be. I think that's a fairly clear trend across not just wrestling, but pretty much anything. Um, One thing I'll point out in relation to this comment, is can discourse get worse? Are we yet to bottom out? Where's this going? Was I wrote an article for voicesofwrestling.com, which you can read now. Um, and it was in response to this Maxine Dupree stuff that's been going on, which if people don't know, Maxine Dupree had a house show match. I think it was like last week against Nia Jax. The match wasn't particularly good, and there was a clip going around where like Maxine was walking to the back, and one fan like booed her and said something like "You suck" and "Don't come back." And there were someone videotaped it and shared it on Twitter saying, "Oh, it's horrible. I hate these fans. Why would they boo Maxine? She's trying her best." And it kind of went viral. Rhea Ripley, amongst others, wrestlers spoke out about it. Like Rhea Ripley said, like, I wish, how would some of you who were working at your jobs like to be booed as you were learning? Be better as people. She did some finger wagging, which I thought was obnoxious. And I wrote basically it's completely ridiculous to not expect people to boo at a wrestling show. This is WWE, it's the major leagues. If Maxine is learning on the job and she's only had 13 career matches, which is how many career matches she's had, that's on the company for advertising itself as a major league product and presenting someone with very, very little experience. Um, but it got me thinking about like, this whole culture of people who they're like new wrestling fans. They might be children, and they might not be children. They might be teenagers, they might be young adults, they might be older people, but kind of like these new wrestling fans that really don't have any ability to discern what is good and what is bad. They don't have experience, they don't have a relationship with wrestling to really draw on what they like and what they dislike if they're new fans. Um, Especially if they've never seen anything other than WWE's wrestling product. They don't have, the outside of WWE knowledge that most of the people listening to the show are going to have. And kind of like the discourse between those people and like the rest of the wrestling world, I'm interested in seeing how that kind of develops, because if WWE has all these new fans and some of their rating trends, getting a younger audience, losing some older fans and gaining a younger audience, gaining more in the key demo, getting some of these people that have never watched wrestling before, if those people are going to stick around and those people are going to continue to be part of the discourse, then the discourse is probably going to get worse, because these people, the people that are offended by a fan telling Maxine Dupree that she sucks, um, and to the degree that like even talent like Rhea Ripley are getting involved and agreeing with this fan, that discourse, those are not going to be fun social media interactions, and that's not going to be good for the discourse in terms of like quality discussion, because this is going to continue the trend of people talking past each other. It'd be like having a conversation with these people that are genuinely think Maxine is really good, and she's trying, and you should support her and you should cheer for her and you shouldn't boo. Like that's like if I were to talk to like, my 2-year-old nephew while he was watching an episode of like I don't know, Teletubbies or something, and I was like, hey, Teletubbies is actually a bad show, right? Like, that this isn't good, right? This is just really repetitive writing, and that these characters have no depth to them and whatever. Like this is like I'm talking to a child, because they don't know any better when they're talking about wrestling and they want to give their opinion. And if they want to engage in it with me, we're not going to be able to relate to each other at all. Just like I'm not going to be able to relate to my 2-year-old cousin, um, who's watching Teletubbies, and like our relationship to the products are going to be so vastly different that we cannot really have a conversation about them that makes any sense. And that's what these people are like. They're like wrestling infants. Um, and until they kind of gain knowledge and appreciation like the rest of the wrestling fan base, it's going to be worthless talking to them. And these people also tend to be very online, which is kind of why these things like this Maxine story kind of broke out, because a lot of these people were online and pushing it. Um, but if that continues as a trend, then that's bad for the discourse. So that's a very long answer to that question. But next up, JGM asks thoughts on the Observer Awards this year. So the Observer Awards came out last Friday. I have seen them all. I read the issue. I know Joe gave a really long piece of audio giving his feedback on the Observer Awards. So the notable things about this year were I would say WWE winning some of the promotional awards. WWE won Promotion of the Year. Um, Paul Levesque won Booker of the Year. Nick Khan, I think, won Promoter of the Year. So you saw some of this, WWE overtook AEW in some of these, promotion-based awards. And I think that's, you know, a fair development in terms of what has happened with both of those companies. Um, Now, like in my personal opinion, do I think WWE is better than AEW? Absolutely not. But in like what to expect with the awards, like the key thing about the Observer Awards when we talk about like promotions winning things or matches or wrestlers winning things is when you're talking about like the WWE fan base, um, they're kind of gonna vote for WWE no matter what because a lot of those people only watch WWE, or maybe they watch WWE and maybe a little AEW, and maybe they would vote for AEW if some things were really good, but they're WWE leaning, and that's kind of all they're gonna watch. The AEW um Wrestling Observer Newsletter voters are going to be much more likely to consume other wrestling products. So if they feel like AEW hasn't really been super great last year, and a lot of fans clearly felt that way. Some of them are going to vote for CMLL. Some of them are going to vote for New Japan. Some of them are going to vote for Dragon Gate. Some of them are going to vote for All Japan Pro Wrestling. Some of them are going to vote for Impact. Um, and just AEW needs to be a lot better to win those kind of awards because the fans that are going to vote for AEW are going to compare AEW to a bunch of different wrestling promotions and see which one's the best and complain, look at all the bookers in wrestling and figure who's the best. Um, Not every fan is going to be like that. Some people are only going to vote for AEW stuff, certainly. But I think it's way more difficult for AEW to win awards in that sense than WWE, where WWE kind of has this built-in audience, even amongst observer readers, who are really not going to be as familiar with the wider wrestling world. So even if WWE is not perfect for them, they're still going to say, well, it was better than AEW, so I'll vote for WWE. As opposed to a lot of AEW fans are saying, AEW wasn't perfect this year, and I think CMLL did a really good job, or I think New Japan did a really good job, or I'm really liking the direction All Japan has done this year. And so I think it kind of highlights kind of the difference in the fan voting block. But it also shows something very simple, which I think is WWE fans were satisfied with the company this year, and that's reflected in positive business metrics, and that's reflected in Paul Levesque winning Booker of the Year and WWE winning Promotion of the Year. I think that AEW fans were not as satisfied with the product. I think and I think that was reflected in Tony Khan not winning Booker of the Year and AEW not winning Promotion of the Year. That doesn't necessarily mean that the voting block in cumulatively believes that WWE is better than AEW, but I do think that WWE fans were more satisfied than AEW fans from the product. So I think that leads to a lot of the kind of awards breaking down the way that they did. Um, and I hope, and we know Tony Khan looks at the awards. We some of the awards that were used to be just totally dominated by WWE, things like worst gimmick or most underrated, which are kind of reflective of the creative process, right? Worst gimmick is whoever's gimmick is really bad, and most underrated generally is viewed as most underpushed, which is like talents that aren't getting a fair shake by management. Those used to be dominated by WWE. But this year we saw a lot of AEW, um, you know, angles and worst storyline is another one, right? Worst rivalry, worst storyline. Um, right? That's another one that's reflective booking. Again, used to be dominated by WWE. This year, we saw a lot of AEW acts get voted for worst gimmick. We saw a lot of AEW storylines be the worst storyline or worst feud of the year. And that should be taken into account that there was a lot of stuff that people did not like on AEW this past year. And that should be it's the Observer Awards aren't the end all be all, but they are a fairly unbiased survey of hardcore wrestling fans. And generally speaking, I think a lot of their opinions on things, if you go back in history and see what did fans like and what did fans dislike in the Observer Awards, they tend to be pretty predictive of and good indicators of kind of what the general trend is heading. Like if some storylines are flopping and they're picking up awards among for votes for worst storyline, then that wasn't a good storyline. Sorry. Uh, and I think that that's been reflective throughout history of these awards. And I think it should be a wake up call for AEW that they are placing in these awards when they used to not to, used to be totally dominated by WWE. And that's not a good thing if you're Tony Khan or AEW. CSW 14 says you are now the New Japan booker and want to establish a new main event scene and fix the tag division. Who are you elevating from within, and which wrestlers are you rating, both from other Japanese promotions and from overseas? I don't like fantasy booking again, but uh, a new main event scene and fix the tag division. I really like what All Japan did this past year, which was take their two biggest wrestlers, which are Kento Miyahara and uh, Yuma Aoyagi, and they put them in a tag team, and they kind of had them dominate the tag team division and wrestle these big main event matches. And I think that really helped revive the tag team division in All Japan and made that tag team division feel really important. And I think it helped instill kind of, even though they were tag team partners and they weren't doing necessarily like we can't get along, kind of, a very American TV angle, um, two top stars as a tag team kind of thing. But it helped them kind of appear as generational rivals in a way that, they might be friends, but these are the two top guys in the promotion. And they really hammered home that those are the two top guys in the promotion. And I think I'd like to see New Japan go down that route because there really isn't a lot of life in the tag team division at the moment. Um, and I wouldn't mind seeing something like, you know, Naito is the world champion right now. What if Naito and Sonata were the tag team champions? I know I'm not like super high on Sonata as like a tippy top guy, but I think that would help build the tag team division up, and I think it would help kind of establish, Naito and Sonata as two top babyface guys as tag team champions. Now I know they have their split, Sonata left LIJ last year and formed his own group, but that's just an idea. It doesn't necessarily have to be those two guys, but I like the idea of taking like two top main event guys and putting them as like your tag team champions. I think especially when your roster is thin, especially when you're really leaning on some guys like All Japan was with Miyahara and Aoyagi, I think it's a really good way to go. It keeps things and it keeps things fresh. It helps keep these guys on television or on shows, and it helps keep them in the main event, but they're not being super repetitive because they're kind of doing two things. They're top single stars and they're the top tag team. And there's a really long history of that being the case in Japan. Like you just look throughout, Puro history, whether it's, Misawa and Kobashi or Kawada and Taue or, Inoki and his various tag team partners, Inoki and Sakaguchi, or, even back to Inoki and Baba. Um, it's a long, long history of the two top guys being in a tag team with each other. So I think that's a good way to go. I think I can kind of explore different things. Just in general, New Japan's got to pick some of these new guys and they got to really sincerely push them because I think going the very conservative, very slow route has been effective for New Japan in the past, but I think the dynamics have changed. You're shorter on star power. Some of your old reliable stars have either left the company or they've gotten old very quickly, and the path needs to be accelerated. Yota Tsuji cannot be on a 6-year journey to become IWGP World Heavyweight Champion. That can't be the angle now. I'm not saying he has to win the title this year or it's or like that's the only way to do it, but it needs to be picked up faster, and the fans need to feel like, me as a fan, I want to feel like my investment in some of these younger guys is worthwhile now. I want to make sure that if I'm invested in Shota Umino, or I'm invested in Ren Narita, or I'm invested in Yui Uemura, or I'm invested in Yota Tsuji, that those guys are going to be put in major spots like this year. They don't necessarily have to be world champion, although it wouldn't hurt, but I want to feel like my investment is worth something, and I don't want to just see them like be in a G1 block all by themselves with other young guys and lose to Hikuleo. I don't want to see them wrestling each other in like a forgettable mid-card match on the Tokyo Dome. I don't want to see what's been happening to them for the last year. I want to see, you know, major wins over the remaining established talents, and I want to see, really progressive booking with them, and I don't need them to go on like a 6-year journey to the top. That maybe worked in a different environment. I don't think it's going to work in 2024 in New Japan. They desperately need new blood. So I would be looking at that and seeing what's going on there. I mean, rating other promotions and getting talent from overseas. I don't know what their financial situation is in New Japan, and whether it is feasible for them to like, yeah, I think they should sign, The Rock, or they should sign, maybe they should sign Drew McIntyre if he's going to be a free agent, or they should sign Seth Rollins, or some top talent for AEW, see if you can sign John Moxley full time or something like that. I don't think that's feasible. Um, what you could do is you could look for like, I think, to be fair, like Noah finding guys like Jack Morris, in El Hijo del Dr. Wagner Jr. Um, like finding guys that maybe aren't, as expensive or in high demand in the US, and giving them a position to get over. There's definitely talent out there, around the world, whether that's in the US, whether that's in Mexico, whether that's in Europe. There's definitely talent that you can find, that might thrive once they get into that New Japan system. Uh, and so I would be looking at that as opposed to maybe looking at like bringing in top talent. I mean, I would like to see New Japan use more AEW talent. I don't know specifically what the issue is there, but I always thought that there would be, with this working relationship, I would like to see like more AEW guys headed over to New Japan, and not just your tippity top stars, not just your John Moxleys or your Brian Danielsons, but your younger guys that could gain some seasoning and maybe add some new life to New Japan. Um, like I know some people might scoff at this because they don't think he's very good, but like if Wardlow went to New Japan, it'd obviously be good for Wardlow's development, but I think it would be interesting to see what he can do in New Japan. I think it's interesting that Jack Perry's in New Japan now, even if it's just in the US shows. Like, I think that is an interesting place for him to be, and it makes me more interested in the New Japan product. And I think that there's stuff that can happen for him in New Japan that will be interesting, at least to me. Um, so I think those are possible ways to explore maybe getting more out of that relationship. But again, I don't know if that's a New Japan issue, an AEW issue, a talent wanting to go over issue. I don't really know why we haven't seen more of those guys in New Japan, but I would like that if we did. Okay, hold on. I'm gonna get a quick drink of water. All right, all right, because this is a big question that Gerard just asked. I've just come up with in my mailbag. Gerard asks, do you think there's a tendency for some wrestling fans to try to over-intellectualize wrestling because they feel insecure about watching men and women in tights do fake fighting instead of just enjoying the spectacle and dumb fun of it all? I've talked about this a lot on the show. I've had, psychology experts come on the show and talk about this specific dynamic. And I've thought a lot about it. It's a great question. And I think there are a lot of things happening here. So I'm going to try to give a thorough response to all of the things that I think are impacting this question, which is, in general, this insecurity about being a pro wrestling fan, and people over intellectualizing wrestling. Like, I talked about this in the in relation to like the reliant people talking, oh, rest in ring doesn't matter. It's all about the stories. I watch wrestling for the stories. I don't watch it for the in ring stuff. And we've seen that argument kind of made, especially in relationship to like WWE being superior to AEW because WWE tells stories and AEW just has this in-ring which no one cares about. Um, and I kind of view that as like people don't want to admit that they enjoy the fake fighting aspect of wrestling. They don't want to admit to non-wrestling fans that they enjoy the fakest part of wrestling, which is in their minds, the predetermined outcomes. They'll say, "Oh, I like the storylines," which is like so they can then argue, "Oh, it's just like a movie, it's just like a soap opera, it's just like a book or a TV show or whatever. I like seeing the storylines and the characters talk. I don't really care about the wrestling side of it." I do think that that is a small portion of the wrestling fan base when they talk about that, and why sometimes this gets over intellectualized because they're trying to justify their enjoyment of something that uh, they're afraid to kind of admit to other people that they enjoy the simulated combats aspect of pro wrestling. But I think with a lot of people, though, when you hear that kind of argument, I think that's earnest. I think that's the way that WWE has taught their fan base. In Vince McMahon's version of pro wrestling, the in-ring quality of the in-ring content really doesn't matter that much. It's about stories and it's about over-the-top characters. That is the message that Vince McMahon and WWE has taught people for 40 plus years. And a lot of people, that is genuinely what they are watching in pro wrestling. They don't care about the in-ring. They're not, it's not like they're lying and saying that they're doing this because they're insecure. I think that's just generally what they have been taught, which is they enjoy characters and the entrances and moments, heel turns and things like that, and people winning the title and the storyline that comes with that. And they don't care about the quality of the in-ring content. They genuinely feel that way. They're not lying about it. It's an earnest thought. And I think that is a lot of when you hear a lot of this, like when people would say they don't like the in-ring content, um, they don't care about the matches. I think that's where they're really coming from. It's just that's what WWE has taught people. And as we've kind of gone over in this podcast a few times now, it's a huge part of the wrestling audience is just WWE dominating um, people's views of pro wrestling. And so fans come up, they don't know any better. And that's what they've been taught by WWE. And so that's where I think a lot of this comes from. Um, so you have that. You have the earnest people who genuinely feel that way. You have the people who are insecure um, about like admitting they like the fake fighting, so they kind of talk about the stories and stuff like that. And I think another important aspect of this is, especially once social media took off and or the internet took off and people could start really conversing with other wrestling fans, seeing what other wrestling fans thought about things. Um, there's always been this kind of response from the hardcore wrestling fan base that has been dismissive of some of the most popular wrestlers of all time. So if you were a kid in the 80s and you weren't reading the newsletter, you would love Hulk Hogan and think Hulk Hogan is the greatest wrestler who ever lived. And then one day you went online uh, and you found out that a bunch of people hated Hulk Hogan because he was a crappy in-ring wrestler. Or, I was a kid, I really liked John Cena. And then when I started going online, I realized there were all these people that didn't like John Cena. I thought he was bad. I remember going online as a kid. And this wasn't like I was probably 10 or 11, so this was like 2005 to put that in reference for people. And I remember I must have been on a message board or a comment section somewhere, and I remember people saying like how overrated Triple H was. And I was a kid, like kind of dipping my toe into the pool of wrestling discourse online. And I was like, what? Triple H is overrated? Why do people think that? He's a 13-time champion. He's one of the greatest wrestlers ever. People think Triple H is overrated. Um, and I didn't know any better. Um, and that would be preposterous for people now. Like it's preposterous to go back and think about that. Like, of course Triple H is. And now I'm like Triple H, one of the most overrated wrestlers of all time. Um, but as a kid, I didn't know any better. And the point I'm getting at is the relationship between like the hardcore wrestling fans and like the less hardcore, less online engaged wrestling fans for so long, really until social media became really ubiquitous and everyone was online, and um the kind of like the smarky online opinion, IWC opinion has kind of lost its cachet or its ability to influence. It's really now pro WWE fans who hold those cards. Um, and I think that has led to some of like this over intellectualization, which is fans responding to years and years of being told that their favorite wrestler was bad by like smarky online fans, and the general thought that the smarky online fans um don't like your favorite wrestler because they're bad at in the ring. You know, they don't like Hulk Hogan, they don't like the Ultimate Warrior, they don't like Bill Goldberg, they don't like Triple H, they don't like John Cena, they don't like The Undertaker, right? And they'll tell you why. It's because they had bad matches. And so I think that leads to a natural defensiveness for some people who will say, well, I don't care that Hulk Hogan's a bad in-ring wrestler. I don't care that The Undertaker never had a bunch of five-star matches, even though I secretly do really care. And I'm going to yell about how Dave Meltzer didn't give Shawn Michaels and Undertaker 5 stars at WrestleMania 25. But I don't care about in-ring content. I only care about the stories and the characters. And those internet smarks, they don't represent me, and they don't represent the masses, because I like the biggest stars, and those people are wrong, and those people don't understand wrestling. It's about storytelling, characters. It's not about in-ring. So I think there is a lot of that is a reaction to just years of that kind of relationship taking place. The idea that there was this intellectual hardcore wrestling fan base that overrated in-ring content for a lot of people. And now those people are kind of conditioned to make the argument that in-ring content doesn't matter because they still feel defensive about those criticisms that were lobbed at their favorite wrestlers. So those are kind of like the three things that I'm talking about here. You have the fans who um, are genuinely insecure about their wrestling fandom and kind of want to steer away from the idea that they like the fake fighting part and will put over the stories and the acting and characters and all that. You have the fans that genuinely don't really feel that. Or, sorry, let me rephrase. You have the fans that genuinely feel that way, that they don't care about the in-ring because that's what WWE's taught them. And then lastly, you have these fans that are naturally very defensive about like Smark opinion or the opinion of the IWC or the opinion of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, Dave Meltzer. Um, and those are the people that are kind of, and that's kind of where we get, I think, the three different main types of people who are maybe part of this like over intellectualization of pro wrestling and kind of focusing on the stories and the characters and all, what does all this mean, as opposed to just enjoying the spectacle of fake fighting. Um, and what I'll say is I think, and I'll give a lot of credit to Rich and Joe because I think they're very good with this, is that there is we're almost seeing a like a post Smarkdom, post IWC world where the real intellectual take now in wrestling, like the really smart wrestling fans now, they're not just sitting there watching their Billy Robinson tapes or Dynamite Kid or Chris Benoit or whatever your internet favorite wrestler was or newsletter favorite wrestler was. It's not just it's not watching about these great technical wrestlers or these people. The real smart take now is actually being able to appreciate wrestlers who were previously knocked for being bad, or wrestlers who wrestle very simply but are effective. So, like being able to appreciate, Sid is a great one. I think Sid is a perfect kind of example of a guy who maybe 10 or 15 years ago the smart opinion would be that Sid was this really bad wrestler who never had good matches, and he had a good look, but he couldn't do anything else. You know, as Dave Meltzer once described him, Sid is like a Christmas present with the world's greatest wrapping paper, but the box is empty. Um, that would have been the take on Sid. Now, the actual smart intellectual wrestling take is that Sid was actually really good. His squash matches were fun. He was, yes, he wasn't going bell to bell 20 minutes having these amazing matches, but he was a fun, entertaining wrestler to watch. And that's almost like this kind of, again, like this post-Sparkdom, post-IWC kind of hardcore fan viewpoint, which is no longer focused entirely on like pure technical quality or perfect selling or guys taking crazy huge bumps. It's an ability to appreciate even the simplest, most rudimentary styles of pro wrestling. And I think that's a really interesting direction where this is going in terms of how that relates to everything, because it's kind of like the worm is turning almost, where 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, the thought was the smart, maybe non WWE watching wrestling fans were the people who were over intellectualizing wrestling. And those were the people who were thinking too much about pro wrestling, unable to appreciate the dumb fun of it. Now it's almost like the hardcore WWE fans, the ones who are gonna, looking for clues in the Fiend videos, and who are, looking at The Rock and the face he made when Cody was saying something. Those people are the ones over intellectualizing things. And the people that are out here watching deathmatch wrestling from Japan, or watching, 1980s squash matches, those people are enjoying the dumb fun of it. It's almost like we've completely done this 180, where the hardcore WWE fans are the ones who are now like overanalyzing everything, and trying to justify this really intellectual approach to wrestling. And the, quote unquote wrestling intelligentsia are the people that are like, like Joe, who's like, yeah, I watched this Virgil versus Ivan Koloff match, or Nikolai Volkov match, from 1994. I thought it was going to be bad, but it was actually wasn't that bad. It was okay. Like, it's totally different than it used to be. And I don't know how legitimate that is, but I really appreciate this question, Gerard, because it really got me thinking about kind of where we are now as wrestling fans as a whole, in terms of like what is like appreciated by certain segments of the fandom, and kind of psychologically how this relationship has kind of evolved over time. So I really appreciate that question. All right, Connor. This is, of course, Northern Ireland Connor, not to be confused with any of the other Connors that are on the Voices of Wrestling Discord. But this is yeah, this is Northern Ireland Connor, or as I call him, Orange Connor. He says, I'd like to hear your thoughts on is with regards to WWE. I think that many wrestling analysts can fall into the trap of thinking that current trends are going to go on in perpetuity. For example, everyone thought that Dynamite catching Raw was an inevitability in 2021. By now, I think that Dave and others speak as if WWE is going to be hot forever. Sometimes I think this is simply because we don't have a grasp on the newer WWE fan base. But I think there are some concerning medium-term signs for WWE. If Cody finishes the story, will fans lose interest, especially with a lack of star challengers ready to go? Will the lawsuit and any potential Triple H versus Rock power struggle have an impact on the product? Could things get messy in the autumn when SmackDown moves from Fox and Raw, seemingly disappears altogether for months before starting on Netflix? How do they bolster their thin roster over the next few years when Tony Khan wins all the free agent battles? So this is a great question by Connor, because it touches on a lot of the things that I've already mentioned to here today. Kind of, where is WWE going to be kind of post WrestleMania? We can all see right now they're really hot with television ratings and live attendance, and a lot of that is due to this Rock angle, and we're led to believe that's going to end at WrestleMania. So let's just assume that's going to happen. Where is WWE going to go from there? Connor mentions Cody. I mentioned him earlier. Like, if people are more invested in Cody chasing after the title than they were him winning the title, especially if there's a lack of challengers, which it kind of looks like there's going to be, um, given the current state of the roster, is that going to hurt the fan base? Is that going to hurt fan interest in Cody because the story is kind of over? Um, what else is going to happen? Like this newer WWE fan base, which I agree, like how loyal are they really to the product? I mentioned them earlier, like it seems from at least the demographics perspective, WWE has added more regular watching fans in the last year or two. But how loyal are those fans really? Are they going to eventually lose interest and go back out? I think a lot of the people that have started watching again, that kind of came back to the product once the news was out that Vince was gone, those fans have already shown that they are willing to tune out years and years of WWE product if it's not interesting to them. So you have to continue to keep them interested. And to Levesque's credit, they've managed to keep a lot of those people interested. And things like Punk coming back and The Rock showing up has definitely helped. But this is not necessarily the most loyal fan base in the world. It was only a few years ago where, again, like Connor said, like Dynamite almost caught Raw in television ratings and certainly in the key demo for certain weeks. So it's not like they're going to be in this position forever. Um, Connor mentions the upcoming television moves. Like SmackDown is moving away from Fox, which is bad for SmackDown. Just it totally is. They're going to go back to USA. If they're going to still be on Friday night, that is going to be a huge decline in ratings. And I think what you're definitely going to see is you're going to see SmackDown, which has been presented as the A show with The Rock on it, and Roman Reigns has been there for pretty much the entire time that it's been on Fox. You're going to see that go back to being Raw because Raw is the number one show for WWE historically, and that new Netflix deal is so important to them to be successful that Raw is going to become like the new go, not the new, but it's going to go back to being the number one show in terms of where the star power gets allocated towards it. So I think SmackDown is going to go way down. Just it has to. Once it moves from Fox to USA. And then there's this huge question about like where is Raw going to end up? Um, it appears it's not going to run on USA after August. So there's going to be like this 5 month period before that Netflix deal is supposed to start, where Raw is not going to air anywhere at the moment. I find it very, 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 very hard to believe that Raw is not going to air anywhere. That Raw is going to just not exist for 4 or 5 months. I think they'll find somewhere to show it. Maybe it will be a streaming partner. Maybe they'll sign an extension to just keep it on USA because maybe USA has hard feelings about them moving to Netflix. But they still have SmackDown. They still have a very strong relationship with WWE, in addition to, NBCU having the deal for the streaming library. So you have that. Why wouldn't USA just be like, all right, we'll keep Raw until through the end of the year? Like, it's going to be a top-rated show. Your network desperately needs it. Maybe WWE wants a lot of money for those last like 4 months, but it's going to end up somewhere. But even then, we still see this period of transition. Raw is going to move to Netflix. I think a lot of that's really beneficial to them at first because getting in that Netflix carousel is hugely important. I think you'll definitely see some people sample the product that haven't either watched it before or haven't watched it in a very long time. But it's still a great unknown. Like exactly in the long term, will being on Netflix, maintain this level of huge relevancy for WWE? It's an unknown question, right? There's a couple of things that are kind of come with that. Netflix series are very popular, but Netflix series are often very popular for a few weeks and then they go away because they're replaced in the carousel by something else. Um, Netflix series, people are used to watching them on demand whenever they want. Are they not going to necessarily tune into a live product like they would for Raw? There's just a lot with that Netflix move that we don't know yet. And while I view the move to Netflix in terms of like a popularity standpoint, an overall positive, there are some potential negatives in there that we are going to see unfold. So I think there's a lot even though the product is very hot right now at this moment, March 2nd, 2024, in 6 to 8 months, we could definitely see a significant decline for all these factors that Connor mentions and that I brought up throughout the show. So it's definitely not permanent. And maybe like that's the way we talk about WWE is like WWE is so far ahead of AEW, and they are. And AEW is never going to catch WWE in terms of total revenue, barring some sort of epic, epic, epic collapse by WWE. Um, but we do talk about like how It definitely doesn't seem like WWE is not invincible in terms of burning viewers, in terms of hurting its current popularity, because it wasn't that long ago where they were bleeding viewers left and right. That was like a few years ago. So obviously anything can happen, and we're going to see some periods of transition. We've already seen a period of transition in terms of creative control in this company. Um, Will that happen again? Connor mentions a Triple H versus Rock power struggle with Rock now on the board, and Brian Gerwitz, which is a former WWE writer and Rock's kind of personal writer, and has done a lot of work with Dwayne. Is he going to be more involved in WWE? What does that say about Paul Levesque? Is there going to be a power struggle? I think if like a power struggle breaks out, that might actually help ratings because people will be interested in buying into that. I mean, they've already kind of leaned into that with The Rock making some shoot comments, directed at Paul Levesque during this WrestleMania buildup. So I actually think if like the word gets out that there's a huge power struggle there, I think fans will tune in because they'll want to see what's going to happen. So they might even lean into that more. But that is, it is something to watch to see kind of, again, this transition period that's happening for WWE and kind of anything can happen coming out of it. They could be even hotter in a year. Absolutely positive, especially going to Netflix. So it's absolutely possible that they could be hotter, but we don't know. It's transition period. And the final question here, it's from Isle of Man guy. I've heard my podcast is very popular on the Isle of Man. So it's unsurprising that I have a fan from Isle of Man. And in fact, it is Isle of Man guy. He asks, how would you handle Okada in AEW if he goes there? Would he be a special attraction who wrestles once every month or so, or do you think he could be a weekly character on Dynamite and Collision? Again, I don't like fantasy booking questions, but to give some perspective on Okada, like I think uh it's obviously gonna be really interesting. If he's living in Japan, he's probably not gonna be a weekly character. But I expect him to be around a lot. I do think like the taping schedule probably helps more because now that you have a Dynamite and Collision show taking place, Okada can come in for and work Wednesday through Saturday and be on two shows. He could set up a match on Wednesday night and be on a show on Saturday night, or vice versa. He could come in, be on a show, set up a match on Saturday and work a match Wednesday night. Like now that you have kind of those two shows kind of on different, halfway points during the week, it allows someone like Okada, who might be flying from Japan, to kind of be more present on the product than it would be if he was pre-collision, you would have him, he'd have to be there for a full week just to be on two different shows. Now he's got a little more time. So that maybe changes the dynamic there. Not sure. I think like some people are expecting Okada to come in and like be the world champion this year. I think Diego Garcia mentioned that in one of his questions earlier, that like, would you keep the title on Samoa Joe so he can lose it to Okada? I don't know if Okada is gonna be world champion in AEW ever. I know because he's Okada and because he's been this deity in New Japan, and he's been this multiple time world champion, and he's coming over and he's this huge free agent signing, and he's still in the prime of his career, that it would make sense for him to be a world champion. But I mean, AEW only has one world title. There are a bunch of people who fans think need to have the world title. So, um, and you only you want to make each title reign feel significant, so you can't just pass around the title a lot. So it's like, okay, Okada needs to come in and he needs to be world champion. Well, Will Ospreay also needs to be world champion. Swerve also needs to be world champion. Who knows what's going to happen with this, MJF whole Wardlow gimmick? Like that could involve the world title. Like you don't have not everyone can be world champion. And obviously Okada could be the world champion. He'd probably be a really good choice to be world champion. And a lot of people would say he'd be the best choice to be world champion out of all those talent I just named. But it's a very competitive spot to be in, and he's not going to be as dominant or as big of a figure as he was in New Japan, where basically the entire company was built around him for 10 years. That's super unrealistic to happen. Um, and fans expecting that or expecting it to even kind of be close, I think are setting themselves up for frustration on how he's going to be presented, because I don't think he's going to be presented like that. Um, and the other thing is you can get around the language barrier in AEW. It's not nearly as big of a problem as I think it would be in WWE, where WWE demands that everyone like cut these 10 to 15 minute promos in the ring. Um, they tend if but I do think that you probably will need somebody to speak on his behalf. He doesn't have to. You can always book around this, right? He doesn't have to cut promos or things like that. Or long promos, because I'm sure he has some limited English ability. Um, but he could get someone to talk for him. The issue with him getting someone for him to talk for him is that he'd probably be a baby. He's probably gonna come in as a baby face. Um, So who's going to be his mouthpiece? Because like you have like Takeshita, right? Takeshita's doing really good work, but he's a heel, and Don Callis is cutting the promos for him. It works nicely. Is there going to be a babyface manager for Okada, or even just someone to help him with promos? Um, who is that person going to be? I can't really think of someone on the roster that would be like the perfect fit to that as a babyface character. Um, so that's a question that will probably have to be addressed if he's going to be a weekly TV character. Um, I'm sure, Tony has made a huge investment in Okada. Um, it probably wasn't easy for Okada to decide to go to AEW, whether that was to go into WWE instead or to go to New Japan, stay in New Japan. So I'm sure that some promises were made about how he was going to be pushed and presented and things like that. So it's really interesting to see how he's going to go on. I mean, I how would I handle Okada? I'd obviously push him. I don't know if I'd make him world champion though. I don't, not this year. Could, wouldn't be a bad idea, but I just think there's younger talent with more long-term major star potential than Okada would be, um, at least in the US. Um, but I would say if I were to make a comparison, um, probably the way Brian Danielson has been presented in AEW, which he came in, he had that I think was the Kenny Omega match his first match, I think it was right the All Out I'm sorry, the Grand Slam 30-minute draw match. Like came in, just had this dream match, boom, he's been off and running. Danielson's done a lot of jobs because he wants to. I wouldn't maybe have all kind of lose as much as Danielson has, but I think Danielson hasn't been world champion, but he's obviously been a very highly effective player in AEW, and he's still, going at a really high rate, and he's been a great, great, great asset for the company. Um, Arguably the most valuable signing they've ever made. So in that regard, like I think that's a good blueprint for Okada. It doesn't have to be world champion. There's probably some better people where the world championship would be more valuable than it would be around Okada. Similar to kind of like Danielson could have been world champion, but there's some people that's probably been more valuable for them to be world champion. um, just to help them, not necessarily to help Danielson. I don't think Danielson really needed that help, and I don't really think Okada needs that help either. Um, so that's pretty my thoughts on it. I mean, he's apparently coming in very, very soon, March 6th. I'll be at the Dynamite. I'll be at Big Business in Boston, which is almost definitely going to be Mercedes Moné's debut. Um, so we'll see, maybe I'll get a chance to see, Okada as well. And maybe he's going to have his first match there. That would be awesome. That's supposed to be a big show. We don't really have a card for it yet. I'm sure we'll start to see some stuff coming after Revolution, but um, looking forward to it. That's it for this episode. That I think it went really well. I again don't I appreciate the question just because for two reasons. The first is I appreciate that people want to hear what I have to say. Obviously, that's why I appreciate all my listeners and things like that. But these were so many really thoughtful questions that really got me thinking about a lot of different things. And one of the reasons I like doing these mailbags is they really help me formulate some ideas that I have, and they really help me kind of go through these. It's a really fun, like I think, like thought exercise in some of the feelings I have about wrestling and some of the thoughts and philosophies that I see going around. And helps me create future content and future episodes when I think about some of the discussions that I'm just having with myself, answering these questions. So really appreciate all the thoughts. And keep up the great work with these questions, guys. I'll be looking forward to the spring mailbag in a couple months. But thanks a lot. I'll talk to you again after a while.